Well, I think Ukraine is imposing its own sanctions. And whenever you've got a total war, which it is for Ukraine, then you have to take your gloves off and you have to use novel tactics. Russia is on paper, the second largest military in the world. China is better than America is the largest. But what it's showing is, in biblical terms, it's a real David versus Goliath. Russia pretends to be Goliath. Ukraine is David. But in that battle, David won. And I think in this battle, Ukraine is showing Goliath that he can't get away with what he wants to. And Ukraine is setting the conditions to eventually win.
Philip Ingram is a retired British Army colonel, former senior intelligence officer. Welcome to our program, Colonel Ingram.
Nice to have you back. Nice to have me back, Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks. Ukrainian underwater drones have struck two Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers in the Black Sea. According to Ukrainian Security Service, this operation has been conducted by Ukrainian Security Service in cooperation with Ukrainian Navy. What is your assessment of this brave and brilliant Ukrainian attack in the Black Sea?
I think it's another very bold move. If you look at what Ukraine is doing, it's attacking Russia's ability to continue to fund its illegal war into Ukraine by attacking the oil refineries, by attacking the oil and gas pipelines, by attacking oil storage tanks. But the one area that hasn't been properly dealt with is this shadow fleet that is moving the oil around the world and therefore still allowing Russia to generate capital from it. And now with this very bold attack against two of Russia's shadow fleet in the Black Sea, it's saying to ship owners that if they are illegally exporting Russian oil and moving it around the world, then their ships and by nature their crews are vulnerable. And because it's funding the war, they are legitimate military targets. So once again, Ukraine has shown an audacious and bold move in the same way as we saw with Operation Spider's Web and the drones attacking Russia's strategic bomber fleet and a number of other operations that are controlled by military intelligence and by the security services.
Do you feel that this is the best way how we should enforce US sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil?
Well, I think Ukraine is imposing its own sanctions. And whenever you've got a total war, which it is for Ukraine, then you have to take your gloves off and you have to use novel tactics. Russia is on paper the second largest military in the world. China is better than America is the largest. But what it's showing is, in biblical terms, it's a real David versus Goliath. Russia pretends to be Goliath. Ukraine is David. But in that battle, David won. And I think in this battle, Ukraine is showing Goliath that he can't get away with what he wants to. And Ukraine is setting the conditions to eventually win.
Let's also cover current trajectory of this war. It would be its fourth year, and probably this war would last longer than US involvement in the Second World War. Where are we now in this fight against Russian invasion of Ukraine, both on the ground, in the air, at sea, and also in the political spectrum of this battle?
Well, it's interesting. How long have we got? We could talk about this for hours. If we do a comparison, because you mentioned American involvement in the Second World War, if we do a comparison to Russia's advances in the Second World War, it pushed the Germans back from Moscow to Berlin in the same length of time it's taken it to advance about 40 kilometers inside Ukraine. So from a tactical position, Russia is effectively stalemated. It is not advancing very fast at all. And UK Defence Intelligence assessed that to take the rest of just the Donbass region would take it another 4 years at its current rate of advance and about another 2 million casualties. So from a tactical perspective, nothing is really going to change unless Ukraine Ukraine's defences collapse, and there's no indication of that whatsoever, or they withdraw from certain areas, which would be giving Russia something that militarily they can't take, because I don't think Vladimir Putin has got another 4 years. Wars are fought at three different levels. The tactical level, which is what we're seeing in the East. The operational level, which is the ability to continue to support the tactical level and to sustain and maintain the strategic political support. And then there's the strategic level, and that's the ability to keep your country together from a strategic perspective, but also to keep your strategic partnerships going so that you have the wherewithal politically and financially to continue the war. Russia, from a strategic perspective, if we look at its objectives that it set 4 years ago, the collapse of Ukraine as a country, the removal of President Zelensky as the leader, the imposition of a puppet government inside Ukraine, and stopping NATO's expansion, Vladimir Putin has already lost. He's lost his strategic objectives. He's had to reframe them in the capture of the Donbass region, and he spent 4 years trying to do that and has failed to achieve it. And therefore, he has effectively lost his objectives in the war so far. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine has won, because Ukraine winning will be pushing Russia out. It's not going to achieve that at the tactical level on fighting in the front line. It will set the conditions for that if it continues to do what it's doing at the operational level by attacking Russia's strategic bomber fleet, by attacking, as we saw with that audacious attack against the Grey Fleet tankers, attacking Russia's ability to continue to fund the conflict, by causing Russia's industry not to be able to manufacture and support its frontline troops, by forcing Russia to rely on North Korea for its ammunition support, by forcing Russia to try and rely on China for its electronics support, and then getting the international community at a strategic level to impose further sanctions or put restrictions on those countries that are supporting Russia in the way they're doing at the moment. But that is a long, slow way of finishing a war. But if we look at historical examples, and we look at the US war in Vietnam, the United States didn't lose a single tactical battle, but they lost the overall war. And that's something that Ukraine, I think, should be hopeful about, because I think the tactics that we're seeing from Ukraine intelligence and security services at this operational level are causing the Russians some real headaches. And we're seeing Vladimir Putin getting worried. But I think he can sustain what he's doing for probably another 12 to 18 months. But then he will start to, and there's a potential that his regime will start to collapse.
Also, there have been lots of speculation and these discussions about how much time still Vladimir Putin has to continue this war against Ukraine. Also, there have been some theories that he can sustain this war for how long he wants, for years. Don't you think that this is another part of Russia's propaganda machine, just to present Russia as an unstoppable force which can sustain this war for as much long as it wants?
It is part of the propaganda. The Russians have got a tactic called Maskirovka, or as you know well, it's all about masking. It's all about putting disinformation out and trying to deflect people's thinking. Russia knows that it can try and create Ukraine fatigue amongst Western countries, and we're seeing that and the frustrations with Donald Trump and some of his negotiations. Russia could freeze the conflict in a way that it can sustain it for a period of time, but that length of time is going to be dictated by Ukraine's actions, and it's Ukraine's actions against Russia's ability to continue to fund the war. So attacking its oil and gas infrastructure, by attacking its shadow fleet, by attacking its airfields, by closing its airspace, by attacking its manufacturing capabilities and hubs, by assassinating generals in Moscow and elsewhere, is bringing the conflict home. And the average Russian, who has been shielded from a lot of it, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, by the Russian control of their press and what is released to the public, and the oppression of any dissenting comments, that control will start to become much more difficult. And I think Vladimir Putin has probably got another 12 months to 18 months before we start to see some real noises coming out and some demonstrations starting to complain at his lack of ability to keep the average Russian safe. And that's what Vladimir Putin fears most, an uprising amongst his own people. He knows he can keep them oppressed to a degree, but if they start to come together collectively in some way, and there's no indications of that at the moment, but I don't think it's that far away, then that's what Putin fears more than anything else, because he knows that he can't survive that.
Let's also cover another round of negotiations between Americans and Ukrainians in Miami, and they have made some progress according to official statement. Let's cover also the role of Steve Witkoff and his probably also his face during negotiations. From my perspective, he looked a little bit stressful and maybe fatigued. What is your take on that, on his role in these negotiations that leaked conversations, and also his recent appearance on negotiations in Miami, because he didn't look well?
Steve Witkoff didn't look well. Steve Witkoff is a real estate lawyer and Donald Trump's golf partner. He is not an international negotiator. And he thinks he can do a quick deal. Well, he can't. He came out of Moscow with a 28-point plan that effectively was a chat GPT translation of the Russian demands into English, and he presented that as out to the press as the plan to bring peace to and stop the war, and it was a complete farce. It's clear that he hadn't talked to Marco Rubio, U.S. Secretary of State, about it. This is Marco Rubio's responsibility. It's his area, because Marco Rubio said it wasn't an American plan, and then had to correct himself very quickly indeed, and brought together a meeting in Geneva with European leaders and the Ukrainian delegation, and that 28-point plan quickly went down to 24 points, and then to, I think, a 19-point plan that is being further discussed in Florida. And Marco Rubio opened the discussions in Florida between the Americans and the Ukrainian delegation. And as he was speaking, the body language, the expressions that were coming out of Steve Witkoff were very interesting indeed. He was feeling very, very uncomfortable indeed. And Marco Rubio was directing his comments as much to Steve Witkoff as he was to the Ukrainian delegation. And I know Rubio and Witkoff don't get on well. I'm concerned that it's Witkoff that's going to take the results of the negotiations that are happening in Florida and take those back to Moscow to sit down with Vladimir Putin and talk them through. But I think this will show Witkoff's naivety, because I'm pretty certain that whenever whatever is agreed in Florida is presented to Vladimir Putin, he will turn around and say it's unacceptable and refuse to sign or to negotiate any further. And it's Witkoff that will come away looking a little bit daft with his lack of ability to get a peace agreement across. How Donald Trump's going to react to that or not, I don't know. There's a lot going on internally within the higher echelons of the US, especially between Rubio, Witkoff, J.D. Vance, who's been very quiet, the US Vice President, and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of State for War, now that they've changed the Department of Defense to the Department of War.
Don't you think that Steve Witkoff's naivety is the main reason behind this new push to make this deal on the war in Ukraine? Do you feel that, because according to Bloomberg, he would call Yuri Ushakov, he would advise Ushakov to organize this conversation between Vladimir Putin, President Trump, and also after that Trump would make another decision and would not provide Ukraine with tomahawks, would organize this another phone call conversations, and do you feel that naivety is the main reason behind this new round of negotiations? I mean, Steve Witkoff's and maybe Jared Kushner's naivety about this, about Putin's willingness to end the war?
Yeah, I think Putin wants to end the war, but he knows he hasn't got a way out to do it. Putin is hurting at the moment, and if he could find a way out of giving him what he wants without having to fight further, hence why one of his demands was to be given the whole of the Donbass without having to fight for it. If he can do that and declare a victory, and then stall things diplomatically for the future, Putin wants time to rest, time to stop the attacks against his infrastructure, time to rebuild his military again and learn the lessons so he can come back and do more. And he's exploiting the naivety of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who just haven't got a clue what they're doing at all. But so I think Putin, if he could find a way of declaring a victory and stopping the fighting, he would do it. But he's not going to do anything that won't give him everything that he wants. I think Donald Trump genuinely wants peace because he wants to get his Nobel Peace Prize. And I think that phone call that got released, if it had been Marco Rubio talking to the Russian delegation and explaining how to approach Donald Trump, I'd have gone, this is normal diplomacy. Whenever you're dealing with people, you have to get on side with them to explain to them how to negotiate and try and put your point across. You will give pointers and tips to every side that's doing it. But with it being Steve Witkoff doing it, I think Witkoff was deliberately trying to manipulate things so that his deal would get through. And it wasn't normal diplomacy. Everything is complex, and it's the subtleties that there are between the personalities, between the words that are being put out, between how each side is seeing things. It's those subtleties that people miss. And the one person that has impressed me with all of this so far is Marco Rubio, who seems to have stepped up a little bit, and it's he that has managed to set aside this Russian 28-point plan that Witkoff had put in, and to get these further negotiations going through. And he knows full well that whenever those the final plan that comes out of these negotiations gets presented to Vladimir Putin, he knows that Putin will find that unacceptable. But he knows that he can then sell to Donald Trump that he has tried. He's put a huge amount of effort into this, whereas Steve Witkoff has gone in, taken some demands, had them translated, and put those out. Rubio is spending a lot of time, in Geneva, in Florida, and elsewhere, making sure that he's dotted all of his I's and crossed all of his T's, as we say in English, to get things right, so he can then convince Donald Trump that it's Putin is the bad guy and not Ukraine.
Also, let's cover this new Wall Street Journal article with title "Make Money, Not War," because according to this article, real motivation behind Trump's eagerness to force Ukraine into a bad deal is the idea that people close to him can make a lot of money doing business and deals in Russia. What is your take on that?
Well, if we look back at Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff historically, and therefore their associates, they've always done a lot of business with Russian oligarchs. Trump has got real estate interests there. Steve Witkoff is his real estate lawyer, so he's clearly got interests in Russia, and therefore they will be seeing this as a way of setting the conditions for the future and doing more deals. That's what drives everything. And Donald Trump keeps talking about the deal. Everything's around the deal, and it's all about finances. And this is where Europe is playing a very strong card by buying American weapons to supply to Ukraine, because that's a deal that Donald Trump will not want to undo at any stage, because it's making an awful lot of money for the United States. There's a naivety around a business approach rather than a diplomatic approach to this, and that naivety has been seen by Vladimir Putin and is being exploited by Vladimir Putin. But luckily, we've got some grown-ups on the Ukrainian side, some grown-ups on the European side, and Marco Rubio seems to be the grown-up on the US side.
Also, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin said that US plan to end the war in Ukraine could form the basis for future agreements, but renewed his threats to seize more territory by force unless Ukraine withdraws from Donbass. According to NBC News, Ukrainian soldiers are not ready to withdraw from Donbass, even if they would receive order from high command. So Ukrainian troops would probably refuse unlawful order to withdraw from Donbass. What is your take on that?
Well, I think if Ukrainian High Command ordered the troops to withdraw from the Donbass, that is a legal order. And therefore, if Ukrainian troops decide to stay, I don't think there would be any disciplinary action. I think the government would turn around and say, we've given you a legitimate order, but if you stay and fight, then the support will continue. There's no need for Ukraine to withdraw. Ukraine has built a number of defensive positions that if Pokrovsk falls, it can move back to its next defensive position and fix the Russians again for another 12 to 18 months, causing thousands and thousands of casualties once again. And the city belts that are behind are much larger than the urban conurbations that Russia's been fighting over so far. So. And Russia knows that it will get stuck and won't be able to fight through these. And therefore, I don't think there's any solution where Ukraine is going to sign a deal to withdraw from the areas of the Donbass that Russia has not captured. And President Zelensky, I think, even before Donald Trump got inaugurated, had come up with a plan where he said he recognized that Ukraine would not, in the short term, be able to take the areas that Russia has captured back by military force. And he would be content to park that and deal with it from a diplomatic position at some stage in the future, because Putin and Putin's regime is not going to last forever. And that is something that he has continued the whole way through in the negotiations, and fits with some of the ideas we're hearing coming out of Geneva and out of Florida, and is giving him the moral high ground because he's showing a path to peace. Whereas Vladimir Putin and his spokespeople have not changed their demands at all. So they're not negotiating. They're not trying to make a deal. They're just being fixed on what it is that they want to achieve. And they're trying to do it without any further fighting from their perspective, because they can't afford more casualties. It is Russia is getting close to breaking point. It'll be a while before it breaks, but it's getting close to breaking point.
Let's also cover recent Russia's failed test of its intercontinental ballistic missile. A Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile launched from the Yasny test site in Russia's Orenburg region failed shortly after takeoff and exploded near the town.
Yeah.
According to Ukrainian war media Defense Express, this accident probably occurred on November 28th. What is your assessment of this demonstration of Russia's superpower?
Well, it's one ballistic missile test that has gone wrong. It's not unusual that ballistic missiles from time to time will go wrong. If there was a series of them and they started to go wrong, then that would be indicative of there being a larger problem. And Russia does have a larger problem. It can't get the spare parts to service its sophisticated weapons, it's losing a lot of its experienced military personnel because it's putting them on the front line in Ukraine, and therefore, I'm sure the servicing and the maintenance of these missiles is not being kept up to the standards that would be expected. But one missile, it would be very naive, I think, to jump to conclusions that Russia is. Or Russia's ballistic missile force is falling apart on just one missile. I remember only a couple of years ago a UK Trident D5 missile launched from our submarine failed not long after launch. But I know that why that went wrong, and I know that the capability that we have is perfectly reliable. So I'd want to get more data on other Russian launches and what Russia's doing before I'd write off their ballistic missile force. It was embarrassing for the Russians, but nothing more than embarrassing, I think, at the moment.
Also, there have been lots of discussions during the first years of this full-scale war about Ukraine, about Russia's nuclear arsenals, that Russia's nuclear missiles could not work in case of its launch, in case of Russia would organize such nuclear attack. Would this add some new speculations to this interesting topic?
It'll always add speculation. There's nothing to suggest that Russia's nuclear warheads won't work. It's got very capable nuclear warheads. It's got multiple ways of them being delivered, not just the land ballistic missiles, but also submarine-launched ballistic missiles. And it's the one area where Russia has continued to invest in the training of its manpower, in its equipment and everything else, especially its submarine fleet. And that is a very, very capable a weapons platform and weapons system that's out there. So it would be, I think, naive to try and write off its nuclear weapons. Interestingly, nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons is the number one intelligence priority intelligence collection demand across Western countries, and Russia's nuclear forces have been being watched very closely indeed during the Ukraine war, and every time they come out with their nuclear rhetoric and their nuclear threat. From what I understand, there has never been any change in the status or the readiness of Russia's nuclear warheads, no matter what they're saying publicly. And therefore, Russia's very quick to turn around and talk nuclear, knowing that it will scare a lot of people in the West. But the reality is they haven't changed the status of their actual nuclear weapons in any way, shape or form.
That's also a really interesting topic to discuss, because nuclear threats were the number one reason why did Biden administration hesitate to provide Ukraine with all means to help Ukraine to win this war. According to Bob Woodward, U.S. administration sees this as a real threat, that Putin could use nuclear weapon in case of humiliating defeat on the battlefield. They gave this possibility probably 50% chance. Don't you think that this was all Vladimir Putin's bluff, and this bluff was spread inside the White House and influenced high-ranking officials close to President Biden?
100% is bluff. It's information warfare. It is putting a threat out there that it will cause people to sit and think twice about what they're doing. Vladimir Putin knows that if he uses a nuclear weapon, even what's called a tactical nuclear weapon, it will have a strategic effect, and that strategic effect will see him further isolated. But not just by the West, but by India, China, and the rest of the world that is providing Russia some form of tacit support at the moment, and therefore it would be a very last option. But he knows that if Russia used a strategic nuclear weapon, against a Western target, then Russia would be targeted back again, and therefore any administration will always be concerned about trying to poke the Russian rat in a way that will cause it to do something silly. And this is one thing that Vladimir Putin, for most of the time, is from his perspective relatively sensible in his thinking. He thinks he understands what's going on. He's maneuvering the international community and manipulating it in ways that is quite masterful when you look at it. But he knows that if he uses a nuclear weapon, he can threaten it as much as he likes, but he knows if he uses one, then he loses that ability to manipulate the international community. He's drawn a line, and he knows that that's the end for him, the end for his regime, and probably the end for Russia. And therefore, it's right and proper that we get concerned whenever the words are out there and look at Putin, because he could go unstable very quickly. He's not at the moment, but he could go unstable very quickly. Or he could use a plausibly deniable outlet like North Korea with Kim Jong-un to start something in Southeast Asia, and build on that. And it's the second and third effects of anything that is done that has to be considered. And that's what I think occupied Joe Biden's administration's thinking. I think Donald Trump doesn't think of second and third order effects, and he barely thinks through the first order effects. He just shoots from the hip on many occasions. And again, that's why the rest of the West is slightly concerned. This is a hugely, hugely complex situation and something that has to be monitored very, very carefully indeed. But from my perspective, the nuclear threats are nothing more than words.
Let's cover our final topic, U.S. military build-up near Venezuela. What are the chances for U.S. ground invasion of Venezuela? And according to Washington Post, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth gave an order to kill everybody in the first strike on drug cartels in the Caribbean. And after 2 men survived, the mission commander ordered second strike to kill them all just to comply with Secretary's instruction. What is your assessment of this situation near Venezuela?
Tensions are rising in Venezuela. Donald Trump is concerned about Venezuela for 3 reasons. One, it should be one of the richest oil countries in the world. It's not. And because it's not, its people are oppressed, and large numbers are moving up or being pushed up towards the US border and causing the refugee crisis and the asylum crisis that Donald Trump has been talking about for many, many years. And the final thing is the way the drugs cartels are operating with impunity out of Venezuela and supplying a lot of drugs up into the United States and elsewhere throughout South and Central America. And Donald Trump has therefore declared the drugs cartels as narco-terrorists, which allows him to take then legally more militaristic action, which is what we're seeing. The force that he's building up around Venezuela is huge. And he's doing all of this to try and put as much pressure on the Venezuelan government as he possibly can to try and force them to collapse. I think the last thing Donald Trump wants to do is to invade Venezuela, but he will have plans to do that if necessary. He will try and engineer a collapse in the government. He will try and engineer an uprising from opposition parties. And we have to remember that the leader of the opposition won the Nobel Peace Prize instead of Donald Trump winning it this year. And he will do that through covert means. He's already said there's covert means, overt threatening, potentially military action coming from outside, but short of putting troops on the ground. And then I think if he did put troops on the ground, he's got a number of options. He wouldn't try and invade Caracas and invade the country in a classic way. He might try and go and secure the oil fields and cut off Venezuela's ability to continue to fund what the government is doing, and then try and persuade opposition parties to negotiate for a US withdrawal and giving the oil fields back. There's lots of options. But the one thing I will say is the size of military capability that is being built up is not something that you can sustain indefinitely. And therefore, there's going to have to be something to do with it. Either it is used or it is withdrawn or eased off for a period of time, sometime within the next couple of months. It can't go on much longer than that.
And what are the chances of Venezuela in case of US ground invasion?
Well, if there's a ground invasion, as I say, it will be to take the oil fields or where the oil is distributed from in the west of Venezuela. I don't think they'll go for Caracas. If there is any military action into Caracas, it would be very targeted special forces operations backed by Marines, if necessary, to try and topple the Venezuelan government. But again, when it gets into regime change through military operations, Donald Trump is in very dodgy international legal ground on that. And that, again, would set the precedent where it would give Vladimir Putin an excuse to turn around and say, you're just doing what I did, you can't criticize me, and could stimulate Xi Jinping to say, well, I'm now going to take Taiwan, you can't criticize me. And therefore, there are so many other moving parts around with this. I think Donald Trump would like the Venezuelan government to topple itself. Whether he's going to achieve that or not, I don't know. I see a ground invasion with troops getting into the ground being some way off. If it's a big invasion, I'd see still some way off a small targeted surgical operation, but that's not beyond the realms of possibility.
Thank you, Colonel Ingram, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and
Thank you.
glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.